Well, we're looking this morning at 1 Chronicles chapters 18 to 20. So if you've got it in front of you, it will be helpful. We're going to be looking at some of the extracts from that. Now, some people greet a new Prime Minister or President of a country with unbridled joy, don't they? This person who is now in charge is going to transform our national identity, our country. They're going to be the best ever. Others, perhaps more cynically, expect unmet promises. You know, what might have been with somebody else. Or all these people are the same. They say this, but they'll never do it. But the question always is, will we ever have someone in charge who does protect the nation while doing everything justly and rightly and making sure our worst experiences are addressed? Will we ever have someone like that in charge? In Israel, the nation have suffered under King Saul, and now David is king and he's taken over the throne. He's transforming the nation positively. And as the chronicler writes his book, his first readers look back at David and wish they had a king like that. And perhaps we do too. You know, in days of daily news reports which question the tactics of our government, the awarding of huge contracts with seemingly little oversight, the revelation of the fabrication of fire tests of materials that were used on the Grenfell Tower, the scandal of Windrush families still, etc., etc. Will someone deal with these things? Will they actually get this stuff done? Will it ever get better? Or do we just give up and simply expect disaster? Now, ultimately, 1 Chronicles chapters 18 to 20 tell us that King David defeats enemies and acts justly, dealing with people's offence. And for us, we're going to see that we can know Jesus as the just and victorious King who deals with our offence. First of all, let's see this. There's a king who defeats his people's enemies. A king who defeats his people's enemies. How do you secure a nation? Well, you make its borders safe, don't you? You defend your people. You win the battles that you are engaged in. You defeat your enemies. Now, across these three chapters of Chronicles, the chronicler is describing David and his military forces winning a number of different conflicts. It is, if you like, a greatest hits of David's wars, which occur over a period of years. Now, one of the things to note is that Israel has enemies on every side. The Philistines, they've got Moab, there's Aram or Syria, Edom, Ammon and Amalek. And under King David, Israel defeats them all. Some of them give up easily, like To, the king of Hamath, in chapter 18, verses 9 to 10. Others don't, but are still subdued and defeated. And it all looks wonderful. Wouldn't you and I want David as king? Well, I want us to notice this. Although David does win these battles, he has to keep fighting. It's not one big battle like World War II and then 75 years of relative peace. Also, there are some battles that have to be fought repeatedly. For example, the Philistines are beaten in chapter 18 verse 1, but they reappear again in chapter 20 verses 4 and 5 and 6, 7 and 8. And David's victories are not down to him. The enemies are defeated because the Lord gives him victory. We see this in 18 verse 6. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. It's said again in 18 verse 13. And in 19 verse 13, Joab trusts the Lord to do what is right in the battle with Ammon and Aram. You may have heard of Brian Clough. He was a successful football manager. But his successes were almost all achieved with Peter Taylor by his side as his assistant. No Taylor, no championships. Clough, it is said, was nothing without Peter Taylor, and Clough himself knew it. And in an even greater way, however good a king David is, he is nothing without the Lord. Yes, David does defeat the enemies of Israel, but he has to continue winning. And kings who follow after him will forsake the Lord, and they will lose battles, and the people will lose their security. And the first readers of Chronicles have no king. They want a king. They feel they need a king. And although David is the kind of king they long for, be warned, says the chronicler. The reign of a king like David will bring victories, but they're not permanent. David is imperfect, and any king is nothing without the Lord. You see, they knew from their history they were exiled because the nation forsook the Lord. But the good news is this: Jesus is the king who has defeated our enemies. Jesus has defeated Satan. He has destroyed the devil's work. He has disarmed the principalities and powers. He has made a public spectacle of them at the cross. They're defeated, but they do still cause trouble. There's still a spiritual battle to be fought. The devil is still prowling around, a mortally wounded lion, scheming against us. Although he is defeated, he will still fight. And you and I must fight against him. Paul says in Ephesians 6 that our armour is the gospel, and living for Jesus, and faith, and God's word, and prayer. And you and I will win, because Jesus has already defeated our enemies. Jesus is the king who is perfect. He's the one who is victorious. He is the Lord. See, Jesus is the king who defeats our enemies. Secondly, let's see that we have a king who rules his people justly. A king who rules his people justly. When President Mobutu ruled Zaire in the 70s, he paid to stage the heavyweight title fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, what became known as the Rumble in the Jungle. Now, before all the press from the Western countries arrived for the fight, he rounded up thousands and thousands of people who he considered to be troublemakers, and he rounded them up without trial. He then handpicked 100 of them and had them shot and killed. Why? Well, it was a warning. Step out of line and you will be dead. And so while all the Western press were there to cover the fight, the capital of Zaire, Kinshasa, had the lowest crime rate in the whole of Africa. You see, people become scared of their rulers when they're unjust, don't they? You know, what will they do next? We'd better toe the line. They live in fear. And how can you trust rulers like this to do what is right for the country or for you when they rule by fear and violence? We read in chapter 18 verse 14 that David did what was just and what was right for all his people. He did this for everyone in all Israel. And he organised the nation's army, the civil service and the priesthood. You see, David was a king that people could trust. He was faithful to God's own principles, which he knew from the law. And the plunder and tribute he gained from his victories, we read, he dedicated to the Lord for the building of the temple. See, David is the ideal king for the ideal nation. He is bringing rest to the nation, which they will enjoy under Solomon his son. But of course, the first readers of Chronicles know also that David isn't perfect. For example, he wouldn't discipline his children. He stole Bathsheba from Uriah. He had Uriah killed. He lied to his people. So what kind of king do they need? Well, they need to wait for God to send them the ideal king. They need to trust that God's people will one day be led by a just and right king. A ruler who not only says the right thing, but does the right thing. But the question and the challenge they have and the fear they have is this: will it ever get better? Will this king come? The Beatles sang a song which said, "It's getting better all the time." And the song is is referring to a new relationship and how that is changing the singer. But in the song, it doesn't seem like things are getting much better, really. Okay, the singer is no longer mean to his girlfriend, or beating her up, or having to put up with school rules, but it doesn't seem to be getting much better. And the question is, will it ever get better for us? Will it ever get better for us? Well, it will, and it has. You see, the king that the exiles were hoping for has come. Jesus is the king who does what is just and what is right for us. He always does. He never acts to scare people into obedience like Mobutu. He never acts with injustice. He can always be trusted to do what is just and right for all his people. He is the true king who rules in accordance with God's principles, God's law. Jesus does not reign to gain popularity because he is perfectly loved by the Father and the Spirit. He doesn't use his authority to increase his power because he has all power. He doesn't need the spoils of war to secure his kingdom because his kingdom is eternal. But is his rule really just and right? At times we're tempted to think that isn't true. Jesus may be king, but how is this part of my life just? How is terminal illness just? How is rejection just? How is unemployment just? Will it ever get better? But we could turn this around, couldn't we? You know, if Jesus is the true king who always does what is just and right for us, then our circumstances that he places us in are just and right. Our experiences are just, even when we feel we've been dealt with unjustly. He will do right with our souls for eternity. Will it ever get better? Yes, it will. See, Jesus does what is just and right for all his people. He is the king who is gentle and humble in heart. He is the king who gives complete and eternal rest. He is the king who we can trust with our lives. And it will get better forever. See, Jesus is the king who always does what is just and right for his people. And thirdly, we have a king who deals with his people's offence. A king who deals with his people's offence. Now, we have this rather strange incident, don't we, which covers pretty much the whole of chapter 19, where David has an incident with the Ammonites. And the incident reveals David's heart and his love for his people. You have King Nahash, king of Ammon, who had also been on the wrong side of Saul and obviously was an ally of David. This man dies. And when David gets the news, he sends a delegation to mourn with King Nahash's son. David's heart. But the Ammonites misread this as a spying raid, and they humiliate this delegation. They cut off the men's beards. And we have to understand that the beards were a symbol of manhood at the time. They cut off these men's clothes to expose their private parts. Then they send them back to Israel. Imagine how offensive this is to the men themselves, to the nation, to David, to God. It's deeply offensive. It's disrespectful. It's humiliating. It's deliberate aggression. We all hate being humiliated, don't we? But we have a strange enjoyment of others being humiliated. You know, for example, online you can watch people auditioning for talent shows and they're terrible. They're humiliated and it's not us. And the judges and the people watching laugh along and you might laugh along at home. If it was us, it would be different, wouldn't it? But it isn't. It's someone else humiliating themselves. David's first act is not to strike, but to deal with their humiliation. Go to Jericho, he says. Let your beards grow back. No one needs to see what's happened. I know and you know, and that's enough. David protects them until their offence is removed. Excuse me. The Ammonites know they've offended God. Literally, they became a stench to his nostrils. In other words, they were like a honking cowpat to David. And they prepare for battle and hire an army from the Arameans. David sends Joab and Abishai to battle, and with the help of the Lord, they prevail. See, the stench is removed. The offence is dealt with completely, both the humiliation of the delegates and the offending Ammonites. You have the sin dealt with and the effect of the sin. Imagine there's a dreadful smell in your house caused by smoking. If you clean the room thoroughly, you can quell the stench. But you haven't dealt with what made the smell in the first place, have you? You haven't dealt with the actual smoking. If you stop smoking, you stop producing the smell, but it's still there. It's in the carpets, the curtains and the wallpaper. You need to both stop smoking and clean the room thoroughly. See, Jesus is the King who deals with our offence completely. He not only deals with our sin, he deals with the effects of our sin, the stench of our sin. Yeah? He deals with both the sin and the effect of our sin. See, when Jesus sees us, we are exposed like these men. We are offensive in the eyes of God. And we can't hide our sin. We can't hide our shame. Before God, we are humiliated. But Jesus deals with our offensiveness. He deals with our sin. He takes the penalty for it. He covers our evil. He clothes our shame with his righteousness. He lifts us out of our humiliation and gives us his kingdom. He crowns us with glory. But he also deals with the effects of our sin. He gives us his spirit within. He transforms our hearts. He makes us more like him. He sanctifies us. The people the chronicler is writing to want and need a king who can deal with their offence, with their humiliation as a nation. But they don't need anybody. They must trust God to raise up a king like that for them. And even if they want a king like David, they know from history that David is not perfect. David himself is offensive, having stolen Bathsheba and had Uriah killed, for example. See, someone like us can't deal with our offence or its effects. We need a better king, and that king is Jesus, who is perfect, eternal, victorious, just. And we can rejoice in having a king like that. So do you know that you are offensive to God? That you're just like David's delegation? That you can't hide your sin? That you can't make yourself good enough? Well, you need Jesus. He will deal with your sin. He will take away your offence. He will change you on the inside. See, Jesus is the just and victorious King who deals with our offence. And that's great news, isn't it? But the question is, do you know it for yourself? Amen. We're going to sing our last song. It's a new song, you might not know it. It's called Good and Gracious King. And I hope you'll be able to pick it up and sing along at home.